Hi everyone and welcome. My name is Kate Gillis. I'm a policy analyst with the Population Reference Bureau and I'm going to be doing the presentation today. So this is the first part of a two-part webinar series on policy change, youth, and the 2013 International Conference on Family Planning. The goal of these webinars is to provide a chance for young people and those who are working with youth who are attending the 2013 ICFP to start thinking about how the conference fits into the larger policy process and how you as advocates can take advantage of the opportunities provided by the conference to gain additional skills and ultimately to affect policy change. Today's session is going to cover some of the basics. What is policy? Why is data important to policy? How does the policy-making process play out? And how can we use all of this knowledge to influence the policy process and bring about policy change? At a few points during the presentation, I'll ask you all to give some suggestions or examples, and you can do that by typing in the question box of the GoToWebinar toolbar that should have popped up on your screen. You can also send us questions that way throughout the presentation, or you can send questions by email. Since some people's internet connection may not be strong enough to support clear audio, we haven't turned on that feature for attendees for this webinar, so you won't be able to ask questions by voice. We've allowed an hour and a half for this presentation, but since I know conference preparations are keeping us all busy, I'll try to keep this to an hour. I'll follow up by email on any questions that we don't have time to get to today and to provide you with some links to useful resources and to relevant conference events. Finally, after this webinar today, I'll send out a link to online e-courses that we encourage you to complete before the conference and ideally before the next webinar if you're able. Those e-courses will give you a little bit more grounding in some of the content that we are going to be talking about, and it's really the focus of the conference. So to begin with, we're going to talk briefly about what policy actually is. A policy is typically a principle or rule to guide decisions and achieve rational outcomes. Policies apply to governments, institutions, organizations, and groups, and to individuals. While laws enforce or prohibit behaviors, so a law might require the payment of taxes on income, or a law would prohibit marriage before the age of 18, policy merely guides actions and laws to increase the chances of achieving a desired outcome. So why create policies? To give guidance to action on a certain issue, to ensure that things happen, to change what is currently happening, and to prioritize and allocate resources and issues. Policies exist at different levels and for different purposes. While national policies provide necessary high-level leadership and guidance, operational policies are the means for implementing those policies on the ground. So those are the way to make sure that the broader policies are actually put into practice. Operational policies are the rules, regulations, codes, guidelines, and administrative norms that are put into place to translate broad national policies or laws into programs and services. Like other policies, operational policies often exist at multiple levels. For example, a government may introduce a policy stating that all young people should have access to reproductive health services, but translating that policy into reality is going to require a whole set of operational policies related to things like clinic staff, hours, budgets, etc., and that may happen at the national level, at the district level, and then even at the clinic level. So one major policy can trickle down to affect many other policies at different levels. When you think about how you can positively influence policy change, think about operational policies as well as national policies, and think about the different levels at which policies exist and can be influenced. In addition, one policy may impact many sectors. This is especially true for youth issues. So for example, policies about education, health, gender, microfinance, and the environment can all have implications for youth. And conversely, many youth policies have implications in other sectors as well. Okay. Let's pause for just a second to do some brainstorming and get us thinking. Using the questions box in your webinar toolbar, I'd like you to share some examples of policies that affect young people. Those can be a youth-specific policy or just a policy that you know of that has a lot of implications for youth. And think about policies at all levels. Give examples of national policies, district level policies. It can even be policies within your organization or your institution. I'll read out a few of the examples that you send in so we can all be thinking about the different levels and settings that policy exists at. So I'll give you an example to get us started. USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, recently introduced a youth policy. And one of the main goals of that policy was to mainstream youth and youth activities, youth issues. And so that's to make sure that youth are considered in all of USAID's activities. Now, that's a policy for the entire organization. And USAID, many of you may know, is really big. So that policy is going to result in a number of other policies for their departments at both an administrative level and at a more programmatic level to make sure that that mainstreaming of youth goal gets implemented. So other examples that I'm seeing come in are Malawi has a new national population policy that was recently endorsed. And again, that's at a national level. They're now developing an implementation plan that's going to help guide that policy, and districts will have to implement it through operational policies of their own. We're seeing another suggestion for district-level policies that outline what should be taught or shouldn't be taught in sex ed classes in public schools. Here at PRB, I'm thinking about institutional policies. At PRB, we have a non-discrimination policy for hiring because in the U.S., it's illegal to discriminate based on certain characteristics. So at PRB, recognizing that law and also, wanting to follow its guidelines, we have a policy to help ensure that that law is put into practice in our work. Okay, so I'm going to keep moving here. And just want to say that when we think about policy, it's much broader than a single national level policy. It can exist in a lot of different levels for a lot of different groups. As we move forward in the rest of today's session, be thinking about what policies exist that relate to issues you care about and which of those policies you would be most likely to be able to influence. And remember that you may have more success influencing lower level policies rather than a big national policy, and the impact on those policies can be just as important. We're going to turn to discussing the importance of data in the policy process and policy change and how you can use data to strengthen your advocacy and policy change efforts. To start, it's important to note that in the fields of reproductive health, youth, and gender issues, policy is special because it delves into very personal and intimate behavior. There's often hesitance and resistance to discussing these issues publicly. I'm sure you guys have all run into some of this yourselves. And in addition, issues related to childbearing and sexuality, especially when young people are involved, often enter people's belief systems in a way that other issues don't. Unpacking reproductive health topics gets into sex-specific issues and women's issues, which can make it difficult to engage some policymakers. As we'll see, this makes it even more important to have reliable data and evidence when seeking to influence policy change in this area. Some of you may come from a research background, and you may assume that everyone understands the importance of research. You may take it for granted that decision makers will look for and use data as long as it's available, and that policies will be evidence-based. However, this is not always the case. So we're going to talk briefly about why research and data are important and go over some key resources for data. Research findings and other data can be useful in many ways when it comes to influencing policy. Survey data can help identify and define problems. For example, survey data has been really critical to draw attention to key issues like HIV and AIDS and maternal mortality. Data is also important for mobilizing interest and generating support for addressing problems. Data, especially monitoring and evaluation data, can help identify the most effective strategies for addressing problems and can help improve existing programs, services, and policies. Finally, data can distinguish between what we think is going on and what's actually going on. Adolescent pregnancy is a good example of the ways in which data can be useful. Data about adolescent birth rates has been critical to persuading decision makers that they need to pay attention and to take action on teen pregnancy. And as countries try to address this issue, data can help them understand why teen birth rates are so high and what the most effective ways to address the issue are. So data are essential to influencing policy change, but to be effective, the data must be reliable. It's really important to use trusted, responsible sources for data and information. We'll send out a list of some key resources for data on youth sexual and reproductive health and rights after the webinar, but I'll go ahead and mention a few here. To start with, there are the demographic and health surveys. Some of you may be familiar with these. They're nationally representative surveys that collect information on a range of health-related indicators, including contraceptive use, fertility, HIV, AIDS, etc. They're conducted every few years in a whole bunch of countries around the world, and they provide a rich source of data over time. Another great source is PRB's Data Finder. This includes a range of demographic indicators for countries around the world. And you can find that on PRB's website. In addition to these resources, you can also get useful data through reports, program assessments, fact sheets, and other materials put out by international and national research institutions and through other international advocacy and program organizations. You may already know a few of these in your own countries, and we'll also include a few on the resource list. So with all that in mind, we can probably agree that policies should be based on evidence and that research and data can provide really important information to shape and guide policy. Unfortunately, it's not just a matter of writing up research results and putting them out there. Getting research into policy means understanding how policy decisions are made. As part of that, it's essential to educate ourselves about our own political systems. What is the process by which bills and laws are created and passed? Are there committees or parliamentary groups? Are there lobbyists that advocate for one side or the other? What's the budget process? This is going to be different for each of you since each country is different. But if we have any intention of influencing the system, we have to educate ourselves as to how it all works within the context we're working in. Many people assume that policy decisions are made in an orderly, stepwise, rational process. And in this assumption, problems have been clearly defined, program goals and objectives are prioritized, alternative options for addressing the problem are examined systematically, solutions are chosen to maximize goals or objectives. This is what we assume, and it would be the ideal. Unfortunately, it almost never happens this way in reality. You guys have probably run into this. For a variety of reasons, the decision-making process is much more complicated and less predictable than we would like. Before we talk about a model for understanding and influencing that process, I'm first going to identify the components of the policy process. Many different models of policy change have identified these 6 elements as the key components of the policy change process across different countries and legislative environments. So first is the identification of policy or program problems. As we talked about earlier, data is very important here. Second is agenda setting, or focusing the attention of officials on specific problems or issues. In some cases, this may be issues that aren't on anyone's radar screen, like adolescent reproductive health, and so simply getting the issue on the national agenda may be one of the most critical intermediate steps in advancing the process. Next, if everything goes well, policy solutions to the problems are formulated. Then, those solutions are adopted and legitimized. The next component is the implementation of those policies. And ultimately, monitoring and evaluation information is instrumental in evaluating a policy or program's impact. If we think in terms of policy cycles, then that last stage overlaps with the first stage and the cycle continues. We often talk about these components taking place in order, but more often, these components take place in a different order, or are even all happening at the same time. So we need a model that is more flexible than the stepwise model and allows for multiple components of the policy process to happen at the same time, while at the same time offering enough structure to help us identify points where we can influence the policy process. At PRB, we use a model called multiple streams and policy change because it's nonlinear and it was developed with the communications process in mind. This model shows how 3 streams of activity may be going on concurrently: problems, solutions, and politics, and each has a life of its own. Problems are recognized and defined from monitoring and evaluation activities or from research, but there may not be any ready or acceptable solutions. Solutions or policy alternatives may be developed, and some may be viable and supported by research, others may not. But until a solution is proposed, no problem can be addressed. At the same time, you might propose a solution to something nobody else sees as a problem. and the political environment and political events flow along in their own unpredictable way. You may have both an identified problem and a feasible solution, but if there's no interest or political will regarding the issue, nothing will happen. But there can be times when these three streams move together and create a window of opportunity for program or policy change in the center. This intersection rarely just happens. Somebody has to work to help ensure that these streams come together, and it's usually a combination of somebody's and a combination of activities. Let's look at this model in more detail and identify ways in which we as advocates and researchers can create a window of opportunity for policy change. First, we have the three spheres. We've got defining problems. For something to be defined as a problem, people first have to recognize it as a problem and become convinced not only that something should be done, but also that something can be done to change it. Arguments must be made and accepted that a bad condition is due to causes within human control and that it can be changed through a policy solution. Next, suggesting solutions. Different policy alternatives are developed according to their own criteria of selection, whether or not they are solutions to recognize problems or sensitive to political considerations. Feasible solutions are sensible, cost-effective, technically feasible, politically palatable, and relevant to the problem at hand. But we must remember that the selection of a particular solution is often not a rational process of decision-making. Finally, politics and the political environment. Independent of problem recognition or the formulation of solutions, political events have their own dynamics and move at their own pace. Developments in the political sphere can be very powerful in determining the priority of problems and solutions considered. For instance, a change in government, a change in ministers, or a change in the president of an organization or foundation can result in a significant swing in priorities that can move a subject onto or off of a government agenda or make a particular solution more or less appealing. Politicians typically employ some calculus of political feasibility to determine whether a problem should be granted a high place on the policy agenda. Often, their agenda-setting decisions result more from an analysis of the political costs and benefits of attending to a problem than from the technical importance of an issue or proposal alone. So how can we as advocates or researchers who are interested in a particular problem or solution enter the policy process to influence change? We can explore elements or factors that we can proactively manipulate to help bring about that window of opportunity, and think strategically about how to manipulate those elements. We believe that there are three basic elements you can use to affect policy change: agenda setting, coalition building, and policy learning. We'll look at each of these in more detail in a moment, but first let's look at where they fit in our model. Those three elements are constantly moving around the three spheres we identified earlier. They can be used to influence the priority of problems, the chosen solutions, and potentially the political feasibility of addressing an issue. The goal is to use those three elements to move the three streams together. So now let's focus on the first element, agenda setting. An agenda is a set of issues in a hierarchy of importance at a given point in time. And the agenda setting process is an ongoing competition among the proponents of a set of issues to gain the attention of certain audiences to affect policy change. The top three audiences we talk about are the media, the public, and policy elites or decision makers. We know that there are many social problems that never become issues, even though proponents and opponents exist. Problems require exposure before they can be considered issues, but space and time on the agenda are scarce resources. So, how do we get them on the agenda? Research has shown that there are four characteristics of issues that reach program or policy agendas. First, there's clear and measurable data that can serve as proof of the problem. When presented well, data has a uniquely powerful effect at giving visibility to that which may remain hidden from view. For instance, in the population field, studies that have highlighted high total fertility rates, unintended pregnancy, and population growth rates have served to mobilize national, states, and international agencies to allocate millions of dollars to the objective of family planning assistance. Before these reports, many national political figures were unaware that any problem existed at all, making it difficult to generate actions. The deeper significance of data as an agenda-setting factor is that it serves as a catalyst for action. Next, the issue has policy champions who are respected and can focus attention on the issue. Whether an issue rises to the attention of policymakers is not simply a matter of chance. A lot depends on the presence of individuals and organizations committed to the cause. Policy champions are committed individuals or groups who define a problem and keep attention focused on that problem over a long period of time. They dramatize concern about the problem using data, and they seize opportunities to focus attention. We usually think of policy champions as very high-profile people, whether it be a minister or even a celebrity. But remember that you can also act as a policy champion. The third characteristic is that there is feasible, cost-effective solution to the problem. Fourth, there are attention-generating or focusing events that shed light on the issue and present the opportunity for the public, the media, and decision-makers to focus on the problem. So thinking about these four characteristics, what opportunities do you think the ICFP could offer for agenda setting? Again, use that text box on the right-hand side of your screen to send in any examples or thoughts you have on this, and I'll read a few out loud. So to start with, you're right, there's going to be journalists there. Journalists are going to be covering this event. It's both going to be international journalists and journalists from your own country. And getting their attention is great because then they might write something about your issue. So that's an excellent way to get it on the agenda. There is going to be tons of new data presented. I'm not even sure how many presentations there are, but there will be an opportunity for you to gain more information or statistics about your issue that you could use in agenda setting. And also some of those presentations are going to include new programs and results from strategies that have been shown to be effective for your issue that you could use as policy solutions. So obviously the conference is a huge event. It's going to draw a lot of attention and provides a real moment for you to build on. So going back to our model, oh, whoops, we've just gotten a whole bunch more. Yeah, so there's a chance for attending decision makers to speak out as policy champions at side events. That is a fantastic suggestion. It's not just, we're thinking about the conference, and I think a lot about the presentations that people are going to be at and the opening plenary. But there's going to be a lot of side events, and many of them will be opportunities for people to speak out on a particular issue. So that's a great suggestion. And of course, somebody else said government officials of different countries. There will be a whole range of government officials, from high-up ministers to people who may be more at the district level. As we talked about earlier, it's really important to think about policies at different levels. So having policy champions at different levels can be really helpful. Okay, so thank you for those questions, or those suggestions, excuse me. We'll go back again to our model and look at coalition building. So if we think of policy formation as being in part about the mobilization of attention, it becomes clear that it's a tireless and continuous job that is going to be better achieved through broad-based coalitions. We define coalitions as alliances involving participants located ideally in a variety of positions in and around government, the academic community, the media, the private voluntary sector, and interest groups. When you're working to bring together a group of individuals and institutions, there are three key elements of coalition building that are critical to consider. First, there should be an agreed-upon framing of issues. For example, if you agree that unintended pregnancies among teens are an issue, you should agree on why it's a problem and what should be done. Second, there must be trust in one another's commitment to the issue so that members of the coalition feel that everyone is willing to share the work and discuss opportunities and challenges openly. Finally, there must be a shared benefit to be gained from participation. If one institution stands to gain more than all the others, there's not going to be that shared commitment to the cause. You can develop or support coalition building in your own work by joining or strengthening an existing coalition, starting a new one, or supporting existing networks as an outsider. So let's think about some opportunities for coalition building at ICFP. I want you to be thinking about people or groups you might be interested in talking to. We talked earlier about it being about there being a lot of policymakers from different countries represented. But also, there may be some NGOs who you're interested in linking up with to work with. They might already work on your issue and you just want to join them, or maybe they do similar work and you want to bring them on board with your issue. Sorry, I'm just looking through some of the suggestions that come out. Yeah, we have somebody wrote in youth peer groups from other countries that are working on the same issues. We might often think of formal groups like NGOs or like research institutions, but there are also formal peer groups and informal groups that may just be comprised of people who get together to occasionally discuss something that can have a lot of power. They may become formal groups in the future, or they can just continue to work to come together on an as-needed basis to advocate together. And somebody mentioned networks and alliances. Yeah, there are those formal alliances that are formed, and again, some informal ones. Those are really some great ideas. I'm going to look forward to seeing the youth coalitions that come out of the ICFP. I expect you all to start talking to each other. So moving back to our model, we'll look at policy learning. In the context of dissemination and policy change, policy learning refers to how decision makers learn about new information, data, or findings. Although policy learning supports agenda setting and coalition building, it's separate from those two elements. It is about teaching decision makers and helping them to understand the issue by providing them with key data and information. Policy learning isn't a one-time event, but rather it's an ongoing process involving the gradual accumulation of knowledge. For example, International Women's Day is a great opportunity to highlight women's issues, but that shouldn't be the only day that policymakers hear about women's issues. Promoting effective policy learning means that decision makers must be reached with multiple sources of information through multiple channels and multiple points of time. And these sources of information need to be accessible to policy audiences. That doesn't just mean that they know where to find the information, but also that it is understandable in non-technical language and with compelling messages. Be strategic and creative when developing materials and try to make the information engaging. We'll look at a few examples of policy learning materials and activities on the next slide. And finally, although policy learning is usually targeted to policymakers and other decision makers, this is an important activity for advocates and researchers as well. If you want to persuade a policymaker to pay attention to your issue or take a specific action on your issue, you should know that issue inside out. Keeping up to date on current research, programs, and policies in your field is going to make you a stronger and more effective advocate. And really, the ICFP is an ideal opportunity to do that. When we think about resources for policy learning, we usually think of materials, briefs, fact sheets, presentations, and that sort of thing. But policy learning can also happen through trainings and other activities. So here are some examples of policy learning activities here at PRB. These include publications, seminars and briefings, policy analyses, electronic communications like our website or like this webinar. Some of you may be accustomed to writing for academic journals or audiences, and while that's an important skill, policymakers often don't have the time or expertise to wade through a highly technical article or pore over a crowded table of data. So keeping materials brief, to the point, and easy to quickly reference means that they're more likely to be used. So think about what sources you all go to for your own policy learning. And what kinds of opportunities for policy learning or activities, policy learning activities or resources could there be at the ICFP? As you think about that, I'll say we've already mentioned the presentations. There is room for a lot of, learning about the new statistics, new programs, etc. that may be presented at the conference. There's also, somebody mentioned side events. That can be policy learning through skills building or through knowledge-based events. And finally, I also want to encourage you to look through the program and look up the auxiliary events that are happening, that might be happening outside of conference hours, and also the roundtables. The roundtables are great because those are going to give you a chance also to interact with other people for policy learning. Oh, and somebody else made a great point. There's going to be policy links shared by organizations that you follow through social media. So we often forget that social media is a really great tool to support other policy learning activities or to lead to policy learning on its own. Thanks for that suggestion. Okay, so we have covered a whole lot of material today. Summarizing the main points briefly. Policy guides decisions and actions toward a desired outcome. Many people assume that policymaking is an orderly, stepwise process, but it's actually much more fluid, complex, and dynamic. If we want to influence policy and policy change, we have to understand the policy process and think strategically about what elements we can manipulate. Information and data, when they're presented clearly and in an engaging way, are really key to us being able to do that. Looking at our model for the last time, if we want to create that magic window of opportunity for achieving policy change, we need to focus on agenda setting, coalition building, and policy learning. There will be a lot of opportunities at the International Family Planning Conference to see different stages of the policy process underway and for you to use this knowledge from today to influence policy change. I encourage you all to look over the program ahead of time to see what presentations or events you might want to attend and what groups and people are going to be there that you might want to connect with. That way, you'll go into the conference prepared to really take advantage of all the opportunities it offers for you to build your knowledge and skills and make your work more effective. During next week's webinar, I'll introduce you to a policy advocacy tool we developed here at PRB to address youth issues specifically. And then we'll talk about what you would want to ask the policymakers and decision makers at the conference and what changes you hope to see come out of the conference. So between now and next Thursday, I encourage you to think about those things, about what you've learned today, what it might mean for what you would want to talk to a policymaker about, and what change you think could come from the conference. Send those ideas to us by email or join us on the next webinar and propose those things then. So before we wrap up today, are there any questions about the presentation that we went through? Any questions about the multiple streams model or about those three elements that we can use to manipulate to bring about the window of change? I'll give you a few moments just to type in any questions you may have. Okay, so somebody asked what the relationship between coalition and policy learning is. That's a really great question. So those two things are separate elements, but all three of these, coalition building, policy learning, and agenda setting, support the other. When it comes to coalition building, policy learning can be a part of that. You can teach, you all can teach other members of the coalition, but more importantly, each member of the coalition is going to bring different knowledge and skills that you can then merge together to support policy learning that you're directing at policymakers. So, a researcher may have one set of skills, whereas an activist from an NGO may have another set of skills and knowledge. So the other question, may you elaborate a bit on operational policy you mentioned in the beginning? Sure. So think about operational policy as really the nuts and bolts of policy. So you may have a policy, the example I gave at the beginning was, you may have a national policy that says that young people should have access to youth-friendly services. That's a great policy, and that is really important. It is very important that from a national level, that directive come down and that they show that there's that commitment and that the resources will be dedicated to that. But then that's not just going to happen on its own. That's going to result in operational policies like a policy for having a staff member who is trained to provide youth-friendly health and reproductive services. It may result in a policy about the hours that clinics are open to ensure that young people have access to the clinic. So, and it may result in district-level policies about how their district is going to be sure to allocate resources to respond to and meet that national policy. Somebody asked what some of the attributes of effective policymakers are. That is, I'm going to sidestep that question a little bit because we don't want to, that's a sensitive subject. But I will say one of them is that they're open to hearing from people who can teach them something about the issue. So they're open and interested in learning about the issue and about hearing what different solutions are. Oh, and somebody from Botswana asks, how do you think youth can influence policy change? Well, so first of all, participating in things like this and the energy that young people bring is much, it brings a lot to the policy process. It serves as a great way to get people's attention. Young people are often very excited. They feel very passionate about these issues. And, when you have that passion coming through, people pay attention. Now, it's not enough to have just the passion. Sharing your personal experience can be powerful, but after that, you want to have the data to back up your position. You want to be able to give policymakers solid facts about what you're talking about. And, in terms of how you can get involved and insert yourself into the policy process so that you can put that passion to work, that can mean getting involved with existing groups who are doing policy advocacy. That's going to be one of the easiest ways. It can be attending events like this and really encouraging policymakers to meet with young people. And when you have those opportunities, think ahead of time about what you want to say. If you have your short, compelling message prepared in advance, when you have the opportunity to meet with policymakers, that's going to be, getting those messages through to them quickly and clearly. They're going to appreciate that, and they're going to listen to you more than they would, if you weren't quite sure what you wanted to say at the beginning. So we have some other questions coming through, some of which I'm going to wait and answer after the call. We have a question about categories of youth at risk and what we would advise in terms of integrating policy agendas. That's a little bit closer to, the specific content of youth policy. We'll get into that a little bit more in the next webinar. The next webinar will be showing a presentation that addresses a whole range of youth issues, including vulnerable populations, and has some specific policy recommendations. And then we'll talk about, how that base of content, technical knowledge can play into your interactions with policymakers. Oh, somebody says it's one thing to have good policies in place. How can one ensure that they are implemented? That's a really excellent point. You hit on something. If you remember, one of the components of the policy process is not just, the formulation of policies and the adoption of policies, then it's the implementation of policies. As you said, it's one thing to have a policy introduced. It's another thing to make it actually happen. So that's where advocates like you can continue to play an important role in advocating and lobbying and really keeping policymakers accountable for implementing the policy. We get back to operational policies that I mentioned at the beginning. A national level policy is good, but there's going to need to be other policies in place to make sure it's implemented. That might mean other policies at the district level. It may also mean operational policies that talk very specifically about the practical steps to getting the policy implemented. And we all know that it also often entails some specific policy commitments to resource allocation. That's always a big question. Okay, so we're coming up on an hour here. I'm really appreciative of all of the participation today. This webinar is recorded, so if you have any questions from the webinar, you'll be able to go onto our website and look through it again. I encourage you to share it with any of your colleagues who you think may benefit from it and may be interested in it. And again, the second part of this webinar, we're going to be talking a little bit more specifically about issues and policy aspects related to young people and what that means for what we would want to ask policymakers, or what sort of change we would want to see come out of the conference next week. In the meantime, I'll be sending out links to those e-courses. The purpose of the e-courses is to give you a little bit of grounding in the topic areas and also some familiarity with really important advocacy documents. Thank you again all for joining. I appreciate it, and I hope you have a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend.